Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Season 7 of the Islamic History Podcast. I'm your host, Mutaki Ismail. In this season, we are discussing the Bosnian War of the 1990s. This is episode 7-14, Bosnia and Srebrenica. Before we get into the episode, let's do a brief recap of where we are so far. Former President Jimmy Carter negotiates a 4-month ceasefire in Bosnia. Croatian President Franjo Tuđman makes it clear he intends to resume the war against the Serbs. When the ceasefire ends, all parties go back to fighting. In early July 1995, the Serbs close in on Srebrenica. And with that, let's discuss the Srebrenica Massacre. Srebrenica. The first time Srebrenica fell to the Serbs was in 1992. But first, a little backstory. Before the war, Srebrenica was 73% Muslim and 25% Serb. However, tensions between the two groups increased in the early 90s as Yugoslavia began to fracture. The JNA added to the tension by arming local Serb paramilitary groups. The war began in March 1992 when the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina declared independence from Yugoslavia. For the next 3 months, the Bosnian Serbs, supported by the JNA, captured most of the territory surrounding Srebrenica. During this campaign, the Serbs destroyed 296 Bosniak villages, killed 3,166 Bosniak people, and displaced nearly 70,000 Bosniaks from their homes. Most of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. One of these towns was Bratunac, just 5 miles up the road from Srebrenica. When the Bosnian Serbs began their onslaught, the Muslim survivors of Bratunac fled to Srebrenica. At least 1,156 Bosniaks were killed in Bratunac. As discussed in episode 10 of this series, thousands of Bosniaks were killed in the early months of the war as the Serbs consolidated their hold on the region. Foča, Zvornik, and Snagovo were all trampled as the Serbs rampaged through eastern Bosnia. In doing so, Srebrenica was soon isolated. The Muslim enclave took in thousands of refugees even as the Serbs prepared to invade. And by the end of April 1992, the Serbs had captured Srebrenica. But a few weeks later, Bosnian government forces, led by Nasser Oric, freed Srebrenica from the Serbs. Despite this victory, the city was still surrounded by Serbs and Serb-held territory and cut off from other parts of Bosnia. Nonetheless, for the remainder of the year, the Bosniak forces in Srebrenica fought to increase their territory and establish a link with the government in Sarajevo. And by January 1993, they had managed to connect with Žepa and Šerska about 18 miles south and 15 miles west respectively. This marked the furthest extent of the Srebrenica enclave. Nasser Oric never made that connection with Sarajevo or even Tuzla. The enclave was very large now, covering nearly 900 square kilometers or 350 square miles. But this did not last long. The Serbs began a counteroffensive over the next several months, drastically reducing the enclave's size. The Serbs captured the villages of Konjević Polje and Šerska. Then they cut the connection between Srebrenica and Žepa. The Muslim enclave shrunk down to only 150 kilometers, while thousands of refugees continued to pour in. Before long, Srebrenica housed nearly 60,000 Bosniak refugees. When Srebrenica was isolated once again, the Serbs began shelling the enclave. With tens of thousands of refugees and no way to get food or medicine, the conditions within Srebrenica were horrible. Anyone who ventured out their homes risked being killed by Serb artillery. It was too dangerous to retrieve the bodies of those who were killed, so they were left in the streets. Dogs and other animals, also near starvation, fed off these bodies. This was not an unfortunate tragedy of war. The Bosnian Serbs were deliberately using hunger as a weapon against the Muslim civilian population of Srebrenica. A Serb soldier later described how this strategy worked.
It was almost like a game, a cat-and-mouse hunt. But of course we greatly outnumbered the Muslims, so in almost all cases, we were the hunters and they were the prey. We needed them to surrender, but how do you get someone to surrender in a war like this? You starve them to death. So very quickly we realized that it wasn't really weapons being smuggled into Srebrenica that we should worry about, but food. They were truly starving in there, so they would send people out to steal cattle or gather crops, and our job was to find and kill them. No prisoners. Well, yes, if we thought they had useful information, we might keep them alive until we got it out of them, but in the end, no prisoners. The local people became quite indignant, so sometimes we would keep someone alive to hand over to them just to keep them happy.
British journalist and ABC News correspondent Tony Birtley snuck inside Srebrenica in March 1993. He filmed the residents of Srebrenica near starvation, waiting for American planes to drop pallets of MREs, meals ready to eat. When the food dropped, the Bosniaks, most of whom were indeed elderly men and women, scrambled in the dark to grab whatever they could. The food drops had to be done at night to prevent the Serbs from targeting the civilians. Tony Birtley was also there on March 11, 1993, when French General Philippe Morillon, commander of UNPROFOR, arrived in Srebrenica with a UN convoy full of supplies. In order to get there, he bribed and lied his way past Serb patrols and blockades. But he managed to make it through and brought some relief to the starving people of Srebrenica. General Morillon only intended to deliver the food, get a look at the situation in Srebrenica, then leave. However, when he tried to leave, hundreds of desperate Bosniaks surrounded his APC, begging him to stay. General Morillon relented. He raised the UN flag over the local post office and told the gathered crowd, "I will never abandon you." 2 days later, he abandoned Srebrenica. To his credit, Philippe Morillon came to Srebrenica at great risk to himself and without approval from his superiors at the UN. And once he returned to Sarajevo, he was quietly punished for taking this initiative and fired as UN commander in Bosnia. But for the short period Morillon was there, the shelling stopped and food and supplies flowed into the enclave. The Serbs were not so audacious to attack a city where the UN commander resided. Once he was gone, the Serbs picked up right where they left off. The shelling of Srebrenica immediately resumed. During this barrage, they killed over 50 Bosniaks in less than an hour, most of them children playing in a schoolyard. If nothing else, Morillon's visit to Srebrenica did have some influence on the UN. On April 16, 1993, the Security Council passed Resolution 819, which declared the Srebrenica Enclave a safe area. The exact words of the resolution stated,
"All parties, and others concerned, treat Srebrenica and its surroundings as a safe area, which should be free from any armed attack or any other hostile act."
20 months later, in January 1995, during Jimmy Carter's ceasefire, a Dutch battalion of UN peacekeepers arrived to protect Srebrenica. Their fancy weapons and armaments looked impressive, and there was hope that the Serbs, Bosniaks, and Croats would work out a peace deal. With the UN forces now in Srebrenica, the Bosnian government needed Nasser Oric elsewhere. He left behind a small Muslim force, perhaps hoping things would get better in Srebrenica now that the UN peacekeepers were there. Of course, as we know from the previous episode, that did not happen. As winter turned to spring and the ice thawed, tensions escalated between the Serbs and the Muslims. By the time the ceasefire expired on May 1, 1995, nobody was talking peace except the UN. And nobody took them seriously. The Serbs launched a major offensive to capture the remaining Muslim enclaves in the east and end the war before the next winter. But the Bosniaks and Croats had signed an agreement ending hostilities between them and were now working together against the Serbs. Furthermore, the Bosniaks had somehow obtained military-grade equipment including artillery and anti-tank weapons. In mid-June, they launched a blistering attack against the Serb forces surrounding Sarajevo, making significant gains. Taken aback by the ferocity of the Bosniak offensive, the Serbs continued with their plan. They began shelling Srebrenica again on July 6 and over the next 3 days closed in on the enclave. On July 8th, the Serbs were pushing forward, the Dutch and Muslim defenses had been overrun, and the fall of Srebrenica was imminent. Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović wrote the British Prime Minister on July 9th requesting immediate help in Srebrenica. He warned John Major the Serbs had launched a massive mechanized infantry attack on the enclave and the UN peacekeepers were either unwilling or unable to protect the city. More than 60,000 civilians, predominantly women, children, and the elderly, have found themselves in life-threatening danger, wrote the president. I urge you to prevent new acts of terrorism and genocide against the civilian population of Srebrenica. Later that day, Yasushi Akashi summoned British General Rupert Smith and French General Bernard Janvier to discuss the situation in Srebrenica. Rupert Smith wanted to use force against the Serbs to protect Srebrenica. However, Bernard Janvier disagreed, saying the UN should not impose its will on the Serbs. There was some speculation at the time that Janvier had made a deal with Serb commander Ratko Mladic not to use airstrikes if the Serbs did not harm UN hostages. Whether that was true or not, Yasushi Akashi decided to go with Janvier's assessment, later stating he did not believe air power was necessary. Meanwhile, those who could flee Srebrenica did so as the Serbs intensified their artillery barrage. They overran another UN post, taking more Dutch soldiers hostage. The next day, July 10th, the Dutch commander called for airstrikes as Serb forces amassed on the hills leading into the enclave. But he was overruled by French General Bernard Janvier. Later that day, the Dutch called for another airstrike and this time Janvier approved it. But he said they would have to wait until the next morning. The next morning, the Dutch commander at Srebrenica was informed his airstrike request had been denied. It turns out he had filed it improperly and would have to resubmit it. By the time a new request was filed, the warplanes, which had been circling in the air for over an hour, were out of fuel and had to return to base in Italy. When they were finally refueled and ready to go, General Janvier again hesitated to approve the airstrikes. When he finally did approve them, nearly 4 hours had passed. 2 Dutch warplanes attacked and destroyed 2 Serb tanks near Srebrenica. A third strike was forthcoming but was called off when the Serbs threatened to kill their Dutch hostages. It did not matter anyway because by now it was too late. The Serbs were on the verge of taking Srebrenica. While all this was going on, 20,000 Muslim refugees were fleeing for another UN base at Potocari, about 3 miles north of Srebrenica. With no NATO airstrikes, no Nasser Oric, and a depleted Dutch peacekeeping force, Srebrenica was doomed. The Serbs conquered it on July 11, 1995. Bosnian Serb troops, led by their commander, Ratko Mladic, entered Srebrenica and took a victory tour. Mladic proudly declared his intention to take revenge on the Turks. But when the cameras were rolling, Ratko Mladic passed out candy to the children and chatted with the gathered Bosniak refugees. He assured them no harm would come if they followed orders. He said the women, elderly, and children could leave, but the men and boys had to stay behind for questioning. As the city fell, thousands of refugees attempted to board buses leaving Srebrenica. The Serbs detained all males between the ages of 12 and 77. Only women, the very young, and the very old were allowed to board the buses. The Muslim defenders of Srebrenica and 12,000 Bosniak men fled the enclave. Their only hope was to reach Tuzla, the nearest Muslim stronghold over 40 miles away. But as they fled, the Serbs began shelling the mountains, killing hundreds at a time. Hundreds more were captured by Serb patrols and returned to Srebrenica. Back in Srebrenica, the Serbs were now going door to door. As they entered the houses, men and boys were detained, though some were killed on the spot. The women were often beaten and raped, and some of them were also killed on the spot. However, most of the women were sent to the buses leaving the enclave. By the next day, most of the enclave had been ethnically cleansed, though a few buses were still arriving to carry the remaining refugees away. Hundreds of Bosniak men and boys were being held in warehouses and trucks. About 1,000 were taken from Srebrenica to a schoolhouse in Karakai, about 20 miles away. The Serbs demanded the Dutch soldiers expel 5,000 refugees holed up in their base in Srebrenica, and the Dutch complied. On the morning of July 13, 1995, the systematic killings began. The captive men and boys were not taken to prison camps to die slowly through torture and malnutrition. Instead, they were taken to open meadows and soccer fields and empty warehouses. Some were bound, forced to lay down, and methodically shot in the head. Some were lined up against walls and sprayed with machine gun fire. Some were packed into warehouses while grenades were thrown inside. Those at the schoolhouse in Karakai were led into the schoolyard and gunned down. By July 16, 1995, nearly 8,000 Bosniak men and boys had been killed. Žepa falls to the Serbs. While some Serbs were committing genocide in Srebrenica, other Serbs were bombarding Žepa, another Muslim enclave 15 miles south. Just like Srebrenica, Žepa was a designated UN safe area. And just like Srebrenica, the Serbs were making a mockery of that term. On July 12, 1995, the day after Srebrenica fell, Serb leader Radovan Karadzic warned the Bosnian defenders of Žepa to lay down their arms and surrender. Meanwhile, U.S. officials were predicting Žepa would fall within a day. They were wrong. It fell within a week. Everyone knew the UN was powerless to stop the Serbs. Bosnian government officials denounced the UN, calling on the organization to take serious action against the aggressors. Before the war, Žepa was a small village, predominantly Muslim, with a population of less than 500. Like Srebrenica, it had the unfortunate luck of being in eastern Bosnia, where the Serbs planned to create their superstate. By the summer of 1995, however, it held over 16,000 refugees. As it became clear that Žepa would fall, France demanded force be used to stop the Serbs and reestablish Srebrenica as a safe zone. Neither the U.S. nor the U.K. were willing to do that, though they were not yet aware of the massacres at Srebrenica. Back in Washington, D.C., President Clinton's Republican opponents criticized his lack of action in Bosnia. Senator Bob Dole, who had shown concern about the Balkans for years, demanded the arms embargo be lifted. On July 17th, Žepa's Bosnian Muslim defenders turned back a Serb assault. This was astonishing considering the Bosniaks were outgunned and outmanned, but it only delayed the inevitable. The situation was growing desperate. The Bosniak defenders threatened to take the Ukrainian UN peacekeepers hostage if NATO did not send warplanes. The Serbs replied they would kill their UN hostages if NATO did send warplanes. They needn't have worried. The United Nations had written off Žepa, stating it could not be defended. The UN had stopped trying and had stopped pretending to look like they were trying. July 18, 1995, and the Serbs were less than a kilometer from Žepa. By this time, thousands of refugees from Srebrenica were arriving in Tuzla. They told stories of mass executions at the fallen enclave. As these stories spread, Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović was growing frantic. He scrambled to negotiate a surrender of Žepa, but Radovan Karadzic refused to talk to him. When asked to explain why he was willing to give up Žepa, the president was straightforward. "This is ethnic cleansing," he conceded, "but ethnic cleansing is in a way better than ethnic murder." On July 19, 1995, Žepa surrendered to the Serbs. Even though Žepa was a defeat, it still had its hero. Colonel Avdo Palić was the commander of the Muslim defenders of Žepa. He led the stubborn Muslim defense that held off the Serbs for nearly a week. But Avdo Palić had reason to be stubborn as his wife and children were with him in Žepa. Having heard the stories of the fate of the men in Srebrenica, he was determined to give his men a fighting chance at survival. Avdo Palić, along with a local imam and a village official, negotiated the surrender of Žepa with Ratko Mladić. The Muslim commander drew the negotiations out for 5 days, even after the Serbs had already begun occupying Žepa. Those 5 days gave his men enough time to slip out of Žepa and flee through the wooded hills to Tuzla or other Muslim enclaves. This prevented Žepa from becoming another Srebrenica. When the Serbs realized they'd been fooled, they arrested Palić and the others with him. They were taken to a prison camp and never seen again. 13 years later, in 2008, a mass grave in Republika Srpska was unearthed. From amongst the many bodies pulled from this grave, DNA analysis positively identified one of them as Colonel Avdo Palić. Bihać. As discussed in the previous episode, the Bosnian Serbs had developed a plan to bring the war to a swift end. This plan included capturing Srebrenica, Žepa, Gorazde, and Sarajevo in the east, as well as Bihać in the west. Despite the setback in Sarajevo, everything had been going according to plan so far for the Serbs. They had taken Srebrenica and Žepa with relative ease. Bihać was a special case. Located near the border of Bosnia and Croatia, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs had been fighting over this enclave for years. Not just Bosnian Croats, but also Croats from Croatia. Not just Bosnian Serbs, but also Croatian Serbs. Not just Bosnian Muslims, but also rebel Muslims who sided with the Serbs. The Bosnian government forces in Bihać were in an impossible situation and surrounded by enemies on all sides. They faced attacks from the Bosnian Serbs to the east, Croatian Serbs to the west, and rebel Muslims to the north. But the Bosniaks were not helpless. Despite their lack of heavy weapons, they had become a formidable force. This again fueled rumors that they had received outside training, possibly from the United States. Or their success may have been the result of 3 years of bitter experience. Whatever the case, the intense fighting made it impossible for UN aid convoys to reach Bihać. By the summer of 1995, the 200,000 Muslim refugees in Bihać were facing starvation. A key moment came on July 22, 1995, when Bosnian President Alija Izetbegović and Croatian President Franjo Tuđman signed the Split Agreement. The Split Agreement, signed in the Croatian coastal city of Split, was a mutual defense pact between Croatia and Bosnia. It allowed Bosnian and Croatian forces to coordinate their attacks on the Serbs. It also allowed Croatian forces to cross the border into Bosnia, primarily to relieve the pressure on Bihać. From this agreement came a cascade of events. First came Operation Storm, a tremendous Croatian offensive to retake territory the Serbs held in eastern Croatia, bordering Bosnia. In late July, the Croatian army began shelling Knin, the Croatian Serb capital in the south. Croatia then moved its forces east to cut off communications and supplies between the Serbs in the south in Knin and the Serbs in the north in Bihać. The Croats also captured 2 towns near Bihać, increasing the pressure on the Serb forces in that area. During the first 4 days of August, Croatia brought nearly 100,000 soldiers to its eastern border with Bosnia. Meanwhile, the U.S. government was getting frustrated with the way things were going. For years, the U.S. had muddled through the Bosnian War, making concessions to Slobodan Milosevic and the Bosnian Serbs just to get them to the negotiating table. And it had brought nothing in return. The fall of Srebrenica and Žepa, not to mention the rumors of massive atrocities, were embarrassing the UN, the U.S., and NATO. American diplomats in the Croatian capital of Zagreb did not try to stop the Croatian offensive. They simply urged the Croats to use restraint and avoid civilian casualties. While this was not exactly a green light for war, the implication was understood. It was time to put pressure on the Serbs. The Croats and the Serbs both sent token diplomats to meet with UN representatives, but neither side wanted to talk. On Friday, August 4, 1995, Croatia launched an all-out assault on the Serbs. They bombarded Knin with over 1,000 shells while tens of thousands of Croatian troops moved in. To the north, thousands of Croatian soldiers joined up with the Bosniak forces at Bihać. This allowed the Muslims to punch through the Serb lines surrounding the enclave. The next day, those same Bosnian Muslim forces from Bihać continued south and linked up with the Croatian forces descending on Knin. This proved to be too much for the Croatian Serbs. By the end of the day, thousands of Serb refugees were fleeing Knin for Banja Luka and other Bosnian Serb strongholds. After more than 3 years, the siege of Bihać was broken. Balkan politics. The Serbs had now lost their capital in Croatia and any chance of taking Bihać. They still had Srebrenica and Žepa, but Sarajevo was looking unlikely. The Bosnian government forces there were not backing down. Radovan Karadzic, the president of Republika Srpska, pinned the blame on Commander Ratko Mladić and tried to fire him as the Bosnian Serb general. But this was more about politics than military necessity. Amongst the Serbs, Mladić was very popular while Karadzic was losing steam. Mladic's plan to wrap up the war by year's end was looking less likely every day. By the middle of August, Croatia had retaken almost all of its land from the Croatian Serbs. The only part left was a small holdout bordering Serbia. This led to 250,000 Croatian Serb refugees flooding into Bosnia and Serbia. There were also political tensions within the Bosnian government. President Izetbegović, having been repeatedly led down by the UN and the West, had begun seeking help from various Muslim nations. This included Turkey, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. His relationship with these other Muslim countries led to accusations that Izetbegović wanted Bosnia to become an Islamic state. Opposite him was Bosnian Prime Minister Haris Silajic. Silajic advocated for a secular government based upon a Western model. Haris Silajic threatened to resign when President Izetbegović chose Mohamed Sakrbi as his foreign minister. Sakrbi came from a well-educated religious family and was a longtime rival of Silajic. While the politicians were bickering, the war dragged on, and the Bosnian Serbs renewed their efforts to capture the final Muslim enclave in the east, Gorazde. In the next episode, we'll discuss how the Bosnian War came to an end.